Hey everybody, thanks for coming out this morning and welcoming me here today too. So I wear a few different hats and I'll show off a few of them here today. I'm an instructor at Wilfrid Laurier University in nonprofit management and social entrepreneurship. I'm a PhD student at the University of Waterloo where I research kind of this. Do I have a UW? Yeah, there we go, right on. Where I research kind of this. How do community organizations buy affordable housing and keep them permanently owned? And then I also help lead Union Cooperative, thank you, which is a CLT-like organization in Waterloo region, where we raise money from community members, charitable foundations, and major employers to buy existing multi-res and keep it permanently affordable through community ownership. We purchased our very first property last October with 58 two-bedroom units. And we did all of that by raising funds from the community without any government support. That's not to say there shouldn't be government support, we just didn't have that available to us. So this has got me thinking a lot about, we put so much of ourselves into making this project successful, as I know all of you are as well. How do we make sure that this truly...
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. No. Sorry to interrupt. I just forgot to mention that the Chinatown CLT session is beginning. The concurrent sessions have begun, so I just wanted to chime in and let you know. Yeah. Maybe, sorry. I started you too prematurely. I was too excited about asset locks is what happened. I'm sorry about that, Sean, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could I see that? Yeah, sorry. We have Chinatown CLT upstairs, second floor, and then we also have the Building Science and Design Workshop in DA 330. I was like, wow, what's going on? Lots of people have to use the washroom suddenly. All right, so, and just to orient you, if you go out this door, big wooden staircase, go up the staircase, you're not going to miss the rooms. It's well signed up there. So please make your way. Deeply apologize, Sean. Okay.
Right on. So we put so much of ourselves into this first purchase, and we know we will with purchases that come after that. We want to make sure that that truly stays a community asset, that it will never be sold off, it will never be used for a purpose other than maximizing benefits for the residents and for our community. So that's what I'll talk a bit about today. It's still a work in progress. This isn't something that I have all the answers to. I don't think, really as a sector we do yet, but I'm hoping we can start to explore it together and build a model that will make sure these resources stay permanently affordable. What I also want to highlight is I don't think there's an immediate or grave risk to CLT assets, right? It's working really well already, but this is thinking ahead, making sure that these resources truly are protected. So today I'll run through a few scenarios that I think will highlight why this is important. We'll talk about what an asset lock is and what the rules currently are for nonprofits and co-ops. Focus in Ontario, but I think it's pretty applicable across the country. How it works in different contexts, including some cool stuff happening in Quebec, and maybe something we can explore out of Manitoba. Why we don't see a whole lot of sale of nonprofit assets or demutualizations of co-ops, although I'll suggest that maybe we do. And then why we should think about this beyond just asset protection, what the benefits are for the CLT movement beyond just the protection of assets. Okay, so a few different scenarios that we can think about. The first one is a growth scenario. Everything worked out perfectly. We bought a building, and now we've paid off the mortgage. The property has appreciated. It's worth a whole heck of a lot of money. This is the traditional reason why we think of an asset lock. There's a lot of value on the table. It's tied into the organization. Somebody could be incentivized to try and sell it for personal benefit. We also can think of a tired team. Right now, there's a lot of grant funding moving into the CLT space, into the nonprofit housing co-op space. The last 30 years, that hasn't been the case. What happens if there's a change, if we lose some of that? Particularly for smaller CLTs that may not benefit from the same scale that urban CLTs do. What happens if folks just run out of steam? really well-intentioned. They've been working hard for so many years. They have to move on. There's no one there to pick up the torch. That it may not be sustainable. We've seen the incredible run-up of interest rates in the past year and a half, 2 years. We're all working on shoestring budgets because we're trying so hard to keep our rental rates affordable. Here we come up to our refinance in a decade, and all of a sudden we can't sustain it. There's not the government support to do it. Because of the Residential Tenancies Act and because of our own values, we're not just going to spike those rents on our existing tenants. All of a sudden, we don't have a sustainable financial model. And finally, a missed opportunity. There may be a case, and this certainly some CLTs will never do this, others may, of selling a property so that you can buy a better, more well-suited property to advance your community. Say that happened. You sold that in 2019, the pandemic happened, a certain deal that you're working on fell through. Since then, prices have spiked, and you can no longer afford a dream property, but you have all these millions sitting in your CLT. So here we see 4 scenarios. These are not bad actors. This is not a situation where folks are trying to necessarily exploit community assets, but we can just see where well-intentioned folks can run into tough situations. So how do we make sure that even in these tough situations, the assets of the community are truly protected? So here are my first thoughts. I've already mentioned the first one. It doesn't take bad intentions to have bad outcomes. Things can get messy once you're operating. Even if someone does come into the organization who you don't necessarily feel great about, it's always, next month, if this happens a little bit more, then I'll rally all the members to get rid of them. It's always really hard to use those bylaw tools that we have in place to protect the organization. When are you really willing to throw down that political capital to do that? There can be compelling reasons to sell. We think of some of these old not-for-profit housing co-ops that were put together in the 70s and 80s. Not all of them were built as well as they could have been because of consistent government underfunding and restrictions on allocations, restrictions by government on how much nonprofits could allocate to reserves. Some are having challenges keeping the buildings up to standard. Say you live in a not-for-profit housing co-op and your building's starting to fall apart. You can't afford it, you're low income, and your building's worth millions. Isn't it socially just to sell that building and distribute the money to your low-income tenants, to your low-income members, so that they can move on to other opportunities in life? Now, as a CLT, we would say, no, we need to make sure we keep those assets in the community. Let's work through that. And nonprofit housing co-ops do have very strong asset locks. But another opportunity where it's not always clear, what is just, what is not, you can make the argument in multiple ways. People don't read the articles and bylaws in the good times. The reason why we do stuff like this of creating strong asset locks is for when things don't work out well. So, right now, your CLT's in growth mode, you're all working really hard, things are going great, perfect. Ideally, you never have to look at these asset lock rules, but we'll be thankful that they're there if something goes wrong. It's the reason why we buy title insurance, it's the reason why we have strict rules in our articles about what happens to our property on dissolution. It's just thinking ahead. There may also be a case where, because of a bank, because of a municipality, because of how you're acquiring a property, that there are multiple corporations involved. Let's make sure that they all have that same access to community protection that your nonprofit CLT does. That it may be that if you buy a property from a landlord, that they want to sell you the corporation that holds it. If that's a business corporation, you're not immediately able to roll that into your nonprofit. The governance protections that exist for a CLT may not immediately apply to that subsidiary. So thinking about how this extends. And last, which I think is most important, regardless, our communities and our tenants, our residents, deserve a backup plan. They need to know that regardless of what happens, they're protected going forward. Okay, so what is an asset lock? Well, first, an asset, this is kind of common sense, but it's property and money controlled by an organization. And it's the result of past efforts. And I think that's another really compelling reason to think about asset locks. As we're building these organizations, they're built on the blood, sweat, tears, and investment of generations before. We cannot lose those investments. That's really important. An asset lock then looks to prevent or limit the distribution of assets. Some asset locks are really hard. You just cannot do it. Others are a little more wishy-washy. You can, but with some restrictions. So you can restrict the payment of dividends, less important for a CLT, for a nonprofit CLT, but also the payment of residuals. So you've paid off all your liabilities after you've sold the building, you've got some money left over. Let's say you have to send it out to a registered charity. Also now, which is important for us as we're moving into the community bond era, is thinking about, do we have caps on interest rate that we're paying out on bonds? You know, you can set up a bond that looks a lot like a preference share, where it's a perpetual bond, it never expires, and has an interest rate that's linked to profitability. All of a sudden, you found a nonprofit way of stripping the assets of a not-for-profit. Asset locks can be legislated, and we see that with charities, we see that with nonprofit housing co-ops, or they can be through restrictive covenants that a municipality may impose upon an organization or CMHC in some of their legacy contracts, or certain contracts as well. You may also see the term indivisible reserves, particularly as it applies to cooperatives. And there's a lot I think we can learn from the cooperative space, particularly in Europe and Quebec, where they've thought a lot about this at a bigger scale, particularly in the for-profit context as well, of how do they preserve cooperatives that may be a target for acquisitions. You know, the really big telecom co-ops in the US, or the big agricultural cooperatives, they're setting aside a certain portion of their assets and saying, regardless, this is owned by the community, it can never be distributed. So why is this important? Well, we can start by looking at the CNCLT definition of a CLT, and it's right up there. It says it's a nonprofit organization. The corporate status, it's a nonprofit corporation, and it never sells the land. So why might it be important that it's a nonprofit? You know, I lead a cooperative, which, because we didn't have that government funding support, we actually set ourselves up as a for-profit, although we operate like a nonprofit. But when we think about the values of a nonprofit, well, we think about the community trust that is imbued in the nonprofit model. We think about the fact that it won't distribute those assets. It's always focused on creating that community good. So when we're making that public statement that this is what we are, and we know that the community is thinking that's what we are too, well, we better live up to it. Here's the Ontario Nonprofit Network. There are 4 criteria for public trust of social enterprises. You know, in the affordable housing space, we don't think of ourselves really as social enterprise, but we're selling a good or service, in this case, tenancy, and we're creating social goods. So it kind of still fits within that. So they're saying it has to have a public purpose and mission. Great, that's lined up with the CLT definition. It operates for public good, not personal gain. Well, you know, that's where we really have to lock down the distribution of assets to make sure it doesn't. And then the last one here is that it retains assets in the public domain for the public good. So again, keeping those assets in the community. We can look at how a business corporation would typically work. We won't spend too much time on this. This is just a slide I lifted from my nonprofit class. But typically, you know, classic corporation. Shareholders are in charge. They appoint the board. Board controls the ED or the CEO. And then you sell some good or service to a customer. The purpose is to generate profit, bring it back up to the shareholders. A nonprofit's a little more messy. You have the members who appoint the board, controls the organization, and there's a mix of the benefits. You're creating social return or social profit, which is a clumsy term, back to the members, maybe out to a funder and to the end user themselves. So we're thinking about this a little bit differently. It is about distributing the control, it's about distributing the benefits. It's not just about maximizing gain for one individual. This is how people understand nonprofits to be, so again, it's important that we live up to that. I'll go through here just quickly for time, but you know, others in the sector are also saying asset locks are important, we need to do more to develop them. My obligatory statement here, I'm not a lawyer, I'm still figuring this out. Who's a lawyer in this room? Those are the people you want to talk to if you want to figure out if this is right for you. So I'm just focusing here on nonprofits. Co-ops are super interesting. They're really diverse, but nonprofits are what most of you be incorporated as. Under both the federal rules, CNCA, or provincial rules, ONCA, there's certain designations if you're a public benefit or soliciting nonprofit, where they're saying that, because you're receiving public funds over $10,000, we think you're kind of special. You're receiving public goods, so you have to live up to these heightened standards. And you may not distribute any of your assets to your members. That's different from a golf club or, some sort of, community club, whatever else, where it doesn't really matter. They're paying fees into the nonprofit. If they close up, fine, take the assets, move on. In this case, if you're receiving MIRA funding from Mayor Chow, you have to live up to a higher standard. Here's the challenge. If you're under the CNCA, the federal rules, that expires 5 years after you last accepted public funding. If you're incorporated under the provincial rules, ONCA, ONCA, that expires 3 years after you last accepted public funding. So here's a great scenario. We're running out of time on our nonprofit. That third scenario I think we had, where we sold our building to buy something new. We couldn't find anything else that fits it. We've got a few $1 million in the bank. We haven't received any public funding in a few years because we haven't had a building. We haven't had anything to raise for. We're no longer beholden to those rules. You take a bit, you take a bit, you take a bit, I take a bit. The rules no longer apply to restrict us. These don't apply to charities. Charities have very different rules. Some CLTs may be a charity, but it's not universal. So, how does it work for other types of organizations? What can we be inspired by when we're trying to come up with our own rules? Well, so charities have to comply with the Income Tax Act, and the CRA will make sure that you do. It was ultimately the tax man that took down Capone. With a charity, you cannot distribute any funds to a member or anyone else for private benefit. That's enforced quite strictly by the CRA. If you shut down a charity, you face a 100% tax of your assets, whether it's a voluntary shutdown or an involuntary shutdown. You don't have to pay that tax if you donate all of your remaining assets to another charity. It works a little bit like an RSP environment, right? Once you submit or contribute money to an RSP, you get taxed if you take it out, but you can move it around within that, including if you want to invest your money in a CLT or a co-op. But here, it's enforced by the CRA. In Ontario, we also have the public guardian and trustee. So really strict rules. Nonprofit housing co-ops are different than co-ops like mine and different like worker co-ops. It's a very specific section, and it has rules that don't apply to other nonprofits, including not-for-profit CLTs, where it says that once you become a nonprofit housing co-op, you can never distribute any of your assets to your members, including if you shut down or sell the property. You have to donate the money to another nonprofit housing co-op or to a charity. So in both these cases, we have a legislated asset lock where it says thou shalt not use this for personal benefit. We don't have that with other forms. We've seen conservation and heritage land trusts have really powerful tools in Ontario because of the Heritage Act and the Land Act. You can protect farmland, you can protect forests, you can protect drinking water, you can protect beautiful old buildings, including potentially a lot of the stuff here on campus that could be if it wasn't owned by a university. And you can do that because the Act specifically allow for a special type of easement. The easement, normally, if you think of like a right-of-way easement, you want to be able to drive through someone's property, you create this agreement, one landowner to the next, but it has to be abutting parcels of land, and it has to have a direct access issue. With these rules, it says you don't need to. It's enough that this nonprofit or charity wants to protect this important social purpose. Well, what if we had an expansion of the Conservation Land Act? What if we had an Affordable Land Act that would allow the CNCLT to actually create an easement and enforce it on organizations like mine? So that in order for me to sell a property, I would need NAT and the CLT board to sign off on that. Currently, we can't do that. This is something that's being talked about also by the good folks at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. Who here knows the Sustainable Economies Law Center? They're super cool. Check them out. The head lawyer there even, she writes her bylaws using cartoons, so they're really accessible. Just really neat stuff. Started the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op to help push back against gentrification and bring more community assets in. So really neat stuff. And this is one thing that they're advocating for in California. A neat thing here is through the Conservation Land Act, the CRA has created the Ecological Gifts Program. So if environmentally sensitive land is protected by a land trust, the owner of that land gets a tax break. So when we start thinking about the advocacy work that the sector is doing right now, the CLT sector is doing to make sure that there's capital gains relief for folks who want to donate a building or land to a CLT, it's tough to justify that perhaps if you know that a CLT can be broken. If we have strong asset locks, we can look to the tax benefits that are already provided to environmental CLTs or environmental land trusts and say we want the same for affordable housing. We're also creating a social good. Folks should be rewarded, not penalized for contributing property to the community. There's some other organizational forms or corporate forms, community contribution companies in Nova Scotia and British Columbia have voluntary asset locks, where at the time of incorporation, the founders can decide we want to impose an asset lock on our organization. In order to change that, you need approval from the government. So that creates a stronger asset lock. Wouldn't that be great if we had that in the not-for-profit sector as well? That's what the Ontario Nonprofit Network was advocating for in that earlier slide. Social utility trusts in Quebec, and I know the CLT has this as one of the CLT styles on their website. I think one organization, maybe two in Quebec, are experimenting with this right now. Really interesting. So generally in common law, in English-speaking Canada, we cannot have trusts that last forever, and we cannot have trusts that are just about securing a purpose. A trust always has to be for someone's benefit. So, Joshua really likes me, wants to give me all this money, puts it in a trust, and it's for me, for my personal benefit. If instead a building is put in the trust and it's just kind of for community benefit, that's not allowed. And you can't keep it there forever. With the social utility trust under Quebec Civil Code, you can do both of those things. Similarly, and this is just me playing around with legislation. I don't know if this is truly true, so one of the lawyers may have an answer on this. Manitoba seems to be an exception, where you can have non-charitable purpose trusts in perpetuity. Wouldn't that be cool if we could, as the CNCLT, create a non-charitable purpose trust under Manitoba's rules and use that to secure all of our assets in the sector? That could be a centralized program using existing tools that are out there. Golden shares were invented both for tech founders, but way before that was used for maybe not the best purposes by the British government when they were privatizing public goods. They said, we're going to hold on to one share that can veto all other voting shares. We could do something like that with nonprofits as well, where a trusted partner like a CNCLT, like the Toronto Community Foundation or the municipality, can vote on fundamental changes that would somehow impact the sale of a property to make sure that this is really acting in the best interest of the community. That may have certain benefits over a really harsh asset lock, where you can say, there may be a case for selling a certain property. Maybe we were donated a small lot back when we were first getting started. We're using it as a community garden now, but if we could sell it, we can use that as a contribution towards 50 or 100 apartments. There may be some case for that flexibility, and a golden share approach may allow that. And last but not least, and one that is currently being used quite often, municipalities and legacy agreements through the province and CMHC will impose certain controls and register it to title. So Toronto's multi-unit residential acquisition program is an example of this. If you sign an agreement with MURA, you have to commit for 99 years or whatever amount you negotiate with MURA to keep things affordable. If not, the city has certain tools that they can use to enforce it. Okay, so Sean, that's great. Lots of interesting stuff here, but I can't think of a CLT that has collapsed because of this. It's a good question. And as a researcher, as a PhD student, the first thing they teach you is always to suggest more things you have to research so you can apply for funding to keep researching it. So I'll say, we need to keep researching this. But I think we do. We certainly see it with mutual insurance companies. We have these really big nonprofit insurance companies that over the past 20, 30 years have consistently demutualized and been brought into the private sector. The Definity Foundation, which is a really important foundation in our space now, was actually created through a demutualization. There are a number of other, Equitable Life being another one as well. MEC is a prominent co-op example. In my hometown of Waterloo Region, we had a nonprofit seniors home that was put up for sale a couple years ago. It was one of those examples I had at the start, the scenario, really well-meaning folks worked hard for decades. They had a big board, and over time they all dwindled down to 3 remaining members on the board, all in their 70s, wanted to retire, couldn't find anyone to take it over. So eventually they decided to sell. And they were going to, really well-intentioned, use the resources to donate it to local charities. So it wasn't about personal gain, but we still would have lost that asset. Luckily, another charity in town saw the announcement. They worked with some high net worth investors, pulled together the funds to buy it. Maybe we can come up with a better solution than having to scramble quickly to do that. So I think there's more than we think. People celebrate successes, not challenges, so we often don't hear about when things don't go right. Charity and nonprofit housing co-ops already have protections. So I think a lot of the legacy housing organizations that Mayor Chow was speaking about that were created back in the 70s and 80s, the last housing co-op in Waterloo Region was created back in Ray days. Our community looks a heck of a lot different now than it did back then. They still exist because they were created by more traditional housing structures, by nonprofit housing co-ops that have those asset locks. They were created under CMHC grants that had full mortgage protection for the length of the mortgage, which are now starting to expire as well. So I think we're now entering into a time where we're using different legal models than we used to, which could create problems, but also because we tend not to have these long-term contracts. If you enter into an agreement with CMHC today for, say, Mortgage Loan Insurance Select, you only have to make a 10-year affordability commitment versus the 40 or 50 that it used to be. Yeah. I think also, number 5, it may not happen that much because people are generally pretty awesome. And we create good governance processes to stop it as well. So if it turns out that this isn't that necessary because people are so awesome and our governance processes are great, wonderful. That would be a really tremendous outcome as well. I think also, as much as I love social finance, because I think it's important to make up for the lack of government support that's very much needed and should come, it does create new challenges as well. We're inviting the investor class into the housing space. As much as we're pushing back against financialization, staying focused on the mission, we are bringing in a new type of interest into housing. It's also really hard to default on a capital grant. It's possible, but it's really hard to do that. So we're opening up new risks. I still think we should do it. Impact investing is really important because otherwise there's just not the funding currently to make it happen, but we need to be aware of that as well. And then last but not least, I think there's reasons we should do this regardless because it's important for the sector. Number 1, you've all worked way too hard to buy these things and your communities worked too hard to take a risk. Just like if you're working on an offering memorandum for an impact investment with Tapestry, you'll have a whole section identifying risks. That doesn't mean your project is inherently risky. It means that you did your homework, you identified those risks, and now you're planning to monitor them and take steps to mitigate those risks. Same here. Take those steps, make sure it's not destroyed. It also lets and reinforces your message to the community that this is a permanently affordable property. You have the tools to back it up. It maintains trust with volunteers, donors, and governments. They know that if they are donating to you, that it will stay permanently affordable. This is cool now too because under the recent Income Tax Act changes coming up soon, foundations for the first time will be able to more easily donate money to nonprofits. Traditionally, they've only been able to donate money to charities. Now they'll be able to donate money to nonprofits. So let's make sure that we can say to them, it's not that much more risky to donate to us than to a charity. It can help justify those tax benefits I mentioned before. It can also reinforce and define the distinctiveness of the CLT movement. we can say more clearly, this is why a CLT is a CLT and not just any other type of affordable housing organization. It comes with this asset lock. And lastly, and I think this is important for the whole sector, it will only take one failure of an impact investment of a CLT for folks to think about this and paint the whole movement. The amount of times after MEC went down that I had people come and ask, yeah, but Sean, can we trust a co-op? You know, that was something that would come up more regularly. Or after We Charity failed, you know, is this something that charities are no longer trustworthy? So I think we all have it, it's incumbent on all of us to think about the health of the sector. Okay, so if we are going to create an asset lock, what are some principles that we should adhere to? The first is no yo-yo asset locks. What we have right now under the existing corporate legislation for not-for-profits, that 3 years for ONCA, 5 years for the federal nonprofit rules, you know, you can go back and forth. If you collect money from the public in 1 year, you're all of a sudden have an asset lock. If you don't for a couple years, all of a sudden you don't. Asset locks work because they lock the assets. They have to be permanent. They can't go back and forth, and they can't be broken. So we need to think about how we can make sure that they're strong enough. At the same point, they have to be flexible. There's so much that we don't know. CLTs are still a new and evolving space. There'll be new opportunities that come up, and the ecosystem around us will change as well. None of us would have thought that impact investments were that important part of affordable housing 30 years ago. And you know, CMHC may keep changing their requirements as well. So despite having this strength of an asset lock, we need to make sure that it's also still flexible. And that may be because the asset lock is enforced by a third party, like a municipality or like the CNCLT, that can recognize that the values are still there, the principles are still there, but we need to change the tool a little bit to recognize where we're at. Consider who the enforcer is. Is it just internal? Which is okay, where it may be a tool that members have to bring it to court to enforce that asset lock if someone does something they shouldn't do. Or is it something like a municipal charge on title where the City of Toronto will step in and say, no, you just can't do that. You know, who is the enforcer in that situation? Just like how charities have the CRA. I think 6 is really, really important. I've seen some pretty interesting ideas about how we can use social utility trusts and other models as an asset lock, but at times it could conflict with the rights of CMHC. I may just not be smart enough. I haven't figured out a way to meaningfully do affordable housing in Canada without CMHC. We have to make sure that whatever the tool is that we create, always it works for the banks and CMHC. That's tricky, but we have to make sure that works. And I'm sorry that I haven't figured out a way to do this without CMHC. Do it early, before problems and before objections. Don't wait until you have a lot of assets to try and do this. It's harder to do. People, minority shareholders, minority members also have the right to object if it hurts their rights, including their rights to get your residuals after, which could actually force you to pay them out. So do this early on and before there's a problem that you have to try and respond to. Think about the needs of the community. There was an article I was reading, and I can't remember the organization. It's a Black-led CLT out in Halifax, I believe, and they were commenting on asset locks, saying that it's more about building equity is their focus of their CLT, and they want to make sure that any asset lock doesn't conflict with that ability of equity building. So there could be community-specific reasons or community-specific factors to consider as well. And the last is seek other benefits. If we're going to give up the right to benefit in the future, which we all are going to do anyways, that's why we're here, ask something in return. Whether that is the tax relief for folks who want to donate land to us, or through a capital facilities bylaw, which is kind of what the multi-unit residential acquisition fund is. But for folks who are in Ontario and are not in Toronto, cities have the power to exempt you from property tax. They don't do it, but they have that power. If you're going to do their job for them and give them permanent affordability, get something in return. At least make them say no. Okay, this is a big long list and we're running out of time, so I won't go through all of it, but there's lots of stuff you can do internally already. And many of you probably already do, which is wonderful. So first off, have great people who are committed to your mission. If they're really committed, you're less likely to have a challenge, at least from bad actors. You could still run into all those other challenges, people getting tired, interest rates and having to make quick changes, having leftover assets and not being able to buy a property, but that's certainly helpful. Connected to that, clear social expectations, communicating to your members, your directors, the community, that it is permanent affordability, no one will ever profit off that. It creates clear expectations, and I hope that for most folks, the risk of being a social pariah is enough to stop folks from being bad actors. You can have clear definitions right in your articles of what will happen with any residual assets. Use the language for charitable corporations as a model for that. If you close down, everything has to be donated to another charity or to the CLT. You can use the tripartite governance model that is so core to CLTs, making sure, because our corporate rules are not always clear on this, that for fundamental changes, and particularly the sale of all or a majority amount of assets, has to be approved by each class of membership. If you have a membership group that includes major institutions, charities, thought leaders, experts, perhaps they're less likely to approve a bad decision than community members and tenants who could get that direct financial benefit. You can think about board eligibility requirements. Is there some interview process that's required? Term limits or staggered terms. A really good thing is don't let your entire board be replaced in one swoop. If you stagger it out over 3 elections, it's a lot harder for someone to take over the board. At the same time, another useful trick on that front is don't allow nominations from the floor. Make sure that your community is able to respond if something bad is happening. You can restrict the activities and powers of the not-for-profit, and that should be done in the articles and not the bylaws. It's registered with the government, and it's a little bit harder to change. For fundamental changes, like selling all of your assets, like removing these asset locks, or amalgamating with another organization, you may require a higher voting threshold, that 80 or 90% of your members have to vote in favor. You may have a higher quorum, that 50% of all of your members have to approve it, not just 50% of the members at a meeting. We all know that life gets busy. There's a snowstorm, the meeting goes ahead anyways, decision's made. You can limit subsequent proposals so that a nonprofit is not just hammered by proposal after proposal. This happens in golf course buyouts of not-for-profits. The developer wants it. The board says no, or the members say no. They just put forward the proposal again the next week with an extra $10,000 or $100,000 in the purchase price and see what happens. You can limit that. You can also restrict the admission of new members or new directors while there's an open decision being made as well. I know this all seems really, maybe a little over the top. I'm not an inherently untrustworthy person or untrusting person, but this is all good things to think about. Make sure that whatever asset locks you have apply to your subsidiaries too, whether it's a new nonprofit that you have to hold a different property or a holding business corp as well. And then think about preventing continuation into a different type of corporation or amalgamation with a different corporation as well that could change these rules. And the last two here, you could work with a third party like the CLT or the municipality who can enforce these rights for you. So you have an independent actor who doesn't have direct financial benefit. If the Toronto Community Foundation has a charge on your property, it's not very likely that the Toronto Community Foundation is going to approve a fundamental change that's going to result in the liquidation of your affordable housing properties. And then the last is, could the sector be the regulator? I mentioned this a few times. Could the CLT create some sort of entity or some sort of arrangement where a fundamental change that would result in the sale of substantially all of the assets would require the sector to sign off on it, just as a second set of eyes? Okay, so that's it for today. I'm going to keep pushing ahead on this. I don't have all the answers, obviously, at this stage. Let me know your thoughts after. We don't have a lot of time for discussion now. I'm continuing with this document review. I'll be interviewing more folks in the in the sector as well, and pulling together some focus groups that include legal experts and folks in the sector to see, can we develop our own principles of asset locks, our own tools, and advocate for that going forward. So that's it for me today, folks. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks for all your hard work to bring more properties into community ownership.